I'll be recording this, so you can once again become, if you talk, you'll become famous on YouTube, and you'll become a YouTube millionaire, just like I have, by posting review sessions. Everyone wants to listen to my review sessions, even people not in the class. It's astounding. So a lot of people ask a lot of questions, and in particular, they ask about some early material. So I think I'm just going to go back to some of the old PowerPoints and kind of just review and summarize that material. So this is going way back. Some people were asking about the May 4th movement and this author named Lu Xun. So this is right at the beginning of this section of the class. Now you remember that after 1911, there is the revolution in China. And by 1912, that revolution has gotten rid of the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty stops in 1912. But you'll remember there was this whole business about this guy, Yuan Shikai, who tried to hold the government together, but then tried to declare himself emperor, and then China fell apart, and there was no effective central government. There was a government that claimed to be the central government, but there was no effective central government. You also may remember that China and Japan were allies during World War I, and so both expected to be rewarded, right? The Allies won the war, so they expect to be rewarded. In the China expected to get territories that the Germans had taken from them back. Germany had taken territories from China, and China expected to get them back after the war since they had fought on the side of the Allies. However, Japan had been promised by the Allies that it could get those territories. So basically the Allied powers took Chinese territory and gave it away to the Japanese. So needless to say, the Chinese were very upset about this. The Chinese were very angry about this, that their territory had been taken first by the Germans, and then despite the fact that China had served and helped the Allied powers, it was taken from them again and given to Japan. So this led a lot of Chinese people to feel betrayal from the West. Right? They felt betrayed. And they said, the West isn't going to help us, they're just out for themselves. The students protested, and I'm sorry, the war to end the treaty was called the Versailles Treaty, 1919. And it's when they're getting ready to sign the treaty that the Chinese learn they're not going to get their territory back. So students, this is, remember, very important, students, people like you, college students, protested this and said this is really wrong. And so China refused to sign. China refused to sign the Versailles Treaty, said we're not going to agree to this treaty that betrays us like this. And this, of course, inspires the students. Well, first of all, the students are horrified. They said, wow, China's so weak that the Allies are able to abuse us and betray us in this way. But the other time, on the other side of the coin, the Chinese students say, wow, we were able to bring change. By being active, by protesting, our government listened to us and we didn't sign the treaty. So these students and many people are going to come to believe that they need to strengthen China, they need to make a strong China, a strong nation state, by radically reforming society. These aren't those conservative reformers. These are people who say we need to completely remake Chinese society if we want to become strong. We need to completely remake it by radically reforming it. And one example of that was this guy, Lu Xun. Does anyone, well, you can tell from this, he went, you may recall we watched a couple movies about him. His father got sick and died, and the Chinese medical doctor wasn't able to do anything to help him. So he went to Japan to become a medical doctor. He said, through this Western knowledge, I can save China. But then do you remember what he went to see I guess you could call it a film strip. They were showing pictures when he was in Japan. Yes, Anna?
And the soldiers were executing the men and everybody else was standing back, not doing anything.
Yeah, he saw pictures from the Russo-Japanese War where there was Japanese soldiers executing Chinese. And other Chinese people were watching them with just these dumb looks on their face. They were just watching their fellow countrymen being executed without caring. And he said, okay, medicine's not going to save China. I have to wake up Chinese people. And I'm going to do that through literature. So he goes from being a doctor to being an author. He goes from being a doctor to being an author. And he says, I'm going to transform China through my stories. And we talked about, he's still very important today. Chinese people still read his stories. In particular, they read this story, this true story of Ah Q. Ah Q was this peasant that everyone kind of looked down upon. He was a jerk, basically, too. He was a coward. And he ends up being executed. But he kind of stood for the old traditional China, the China that needed to be radically reformed, radically transformed. Yes, Dana, you had your hand up?
Yes, you said the main fourth movement was a radical reform of China by Chinese college students.
Right, they're calling for the radical transformation of China. They don't actually succeed in radically transforming China. No one's going to succeed in radically transforming China until the communists. It's the communists who will carry that, who will be able to successfully do that. But this is the beginning. And this connects, this is also key to this question. Someone asked in the review, why were Chinese people interested in communism? The May 4th movement is one reason why they were interested in communism. Communism is a radical doctrine of reform. It calls for a radical transformation of society. So they're going to try and remake this society. So you have people interested in this radical reform, disenchanted with the West, saying the West isn't going to help us, so we don't need to listen to the West, we need to look to something new. We're going to look to communism. I'll come back to that in just a second. And you can see about the same time what's going on, why Chinese people might be interested in this. The Russians had their successful communist revolution in 1917. Right? They successfully have a communist revolution. And so they prove that it can be done. They prove that this doctrine can actually succeed. And you may recall, okay, on one side you have the Versailles Treaty, where the Western powers, particularly Britain and France, betray China, sell China out to Japan. And you may recall that the Western powers, including the United States, will maintain unequal treaties with China until 1943. When the communists took power in the Soviet Union, the first thing they did was to repudiate those old unequal treaties. Right? By repudiate, I mean they got rid of them. They got rid of those old unequal treaties and said, from now on, we're going to deal with China on a basis of equality. So they beat by about 25 years, the communists are willing to accept equal treaties with China about 25 years before the Western countries do. So if you're Chinese, at this point, you're saying, wow, maybe there's something to these communists. Right? They're able to lead a successful revolution, and once they do, the government that they've taken control of behaves really well, behaves honorably. And to make matters even more attractive, the Soviet Union actually will send people to China to help them organize a communist party, and they will give the communists money to help them organize their party. So that's very attractive. So this is a doctrine that promises to bring radical transformation, and it gives an alternative to these Western countries that are behaving badly. These Soviet communist countries seem to be behaving very well. And so when you have people like Mao Zedong who want China to become a strong, just country that takes good care of its people, communism does seem attractive. Communism does seem attractive. Now, I need to talk, someone had asked a few questions about what is communism. So I'll go very quickly. Or first of all, any questions so far? Because I'll be going a little fast today. I want to make sure we get to everything. But please stop me if you have a question. So, what is communism? You may recall I talked about this was an attempt to scientifically study history. The man who founded communism, Karl Marx, thought that history was a science. That history is controlled by scientific laws. And if you can discover those scientific laws, you can predict the future. So by studying history, you can predict the future. And he believed that the economy drives history. So remember, I'm a historian of religion. He would tell me I'm wasting my time because religion is not important. He would say that religion is just a reflection of economic change. That if you look closely at any religious issue, it's actually about economics. That's what he would argue. So economy drives history, and so therefore history progresses through economic stages. And what makes one stage different from another is the type of conflict between classes. There's class conflict. Different economic classes struggle with each other. And what makes them different is who owns the means of production. Who owns the means of production? Who owns the way that you make wealth, basically? Who controls what produces wealth? So, for example, the first period is slavery. The oppressors are the slave owners, and the oppressed are the slaves. It's the slaves who produce wealth, but the slaves, of course, don't own themselves. They're owned by the slave owners. In feudalism, the oppressors are the lords, the knights, the kings, and they control the means of production, which is land. And then peasants work the land. Those are the oppressed people. In the period that Marx and the Chinese lived in was capitalism. In capitalism, the oppressors are the factory owners, the means of production are the machines, and the oppressed people are the workers. And once you do all that, after that, that's the bad news. That's the bad news of history. It's all been all this conflict. The good news was that Marx predicted that all this conflict would eventually lead to communism. Basically, what would happen is the workers would overthrow the capitalists and take control of the factories, would take control of the means of production, and the workers would share everything equally. So in this communist utopia that Marx predicted, there would be no private property, everyone would share everything. Now remember, Marx thought everything was essentially about economics. If you and I fight about religion, according to Marx, we're not really fighting about religion, we're fighting about economics. So if you make sure we all have enough stuff, there won't be any more conflict. Religious conflict will go away. Of course, economic conflict will go away. Political conflict will go away. Once we share everything equally, there will be no more private property. There'll be no more private property. Everything will be shared evenly. Therefore, will be no conflict. Well, if we don't have conflict, we don't really need a government. If there's a problem, we'll just get together and we'll just automatically kind of figure out the problem. We don't need police. Right? There's no conflict. We don't need a court system. There's no conflict. Therefore, we don't need a state. Perfect communism, in the end, calls that there will be no state, that there will be no government. And since there's none of these things, there's going to be no private property, no conflict, no government to oppress you, we will enjoy perfect freedom and happiness. So the idea of communism is not to build an all-powerful state that controls everything. The idea of communism is to one day get rid of a state, so that way we can all have perfect freedom and happiness. Now, Marx thought that the workers would be pushed so far by the capitalist search for profits that they would rebel. You'd keep squeezing those workers, pay them as little as possible so that you could make as much money as possible, but eventually those workers would rebel and overthrow the capitalists. This is where ended up being wrong. Not Mao. This is where Marx ended up being wrong. He thought would happen in industrialized countries first. Of course, it happens in Russia first, which was not an industrialized country. He also thought it would necessarily be violent. There would be violent revolution to get rid of the capitalists. Now, how did Mao differ in this? Marx thought it was going to be the workers, industrial workers, who would rebel first, or who would be the key to revolution. Who did Mao think was the key? Peasants, right. And of course, the Communist Party is the organization that would make this revolution possible. Okay, and we talked about this. The Soviet Union's experience and the Chinese experience were different. The Soviet Union's communist revolution was mostly carried out by urban workers, but as we'll see, Mao will have it be carried out by rural peasants. And this is Mao's genius, that he saw the peasants were the solution, not the problem. Now, one thing people were very curious about was this question. I had a lot of questions about this, so I'm kind of putting them all together. Why is it that Japan invades China? Right? Why does Japan invade China? What's going on there? Now, one thing I talked about was that you had this growing Japanese democracy. In 1925, you had universal male suffrage. In 1925, Japan made it so that all men could vote. Before that time, I think only about 10% of men could vote. But now all men can vote. That's an expansion of democracy. But that same year, the government passed this thing called the Peace Preservation Law. And the Peace Preservation Law made it illegal to form or to participate in a group that denies a system of private property or tries to change our national essence. So basically it made it illegal to form or be a member of a communist or a socialist party, because communism and socialism all called for the eventual abolishment of private property. And if you did this, you could go to jail for up to 10 years. And they even claimed jurisdiction outside of Japan. So if you were Japanese, you went to the United States and joined a communist party, you went back to Japan, they could throw you in jail. So in a sense, the Japanese government was willing to give Japanese people more democracy, to integrate them into the democracy, to get them to support the democracy, but wanted to make sure that they would vote for the right people, that they wouldn't vote for communists or anything like that. Right, so Japanese people are given the right to, Japanese men are given the right to vote in larger numbers, but they're also being told, hey, we're giving you this right, we want you to use it responsibly, we don't want you to vote for the communists and the socialists. Now, Japan in the 1920s, before the Great Depression, remember we have to stress, before the 1920s, before the Great Depression, Japan already faces some issues. Right, Japan is going to have, in the 1920s, there'll be increasing rural poverty. There's also, you may remember, Japan made a lot of money off World War I because they were selling weapons and armaments and supplies to the Europeans so that they could kill each other. And the Japanese made a whole bunch of money. Remember, their industrial capacity more than quadrupled, went up by more than 4 times during this time period. That's very good. But that led to overcapacity. So when the Europeans stopped killing each other, all of a sudden the Japanese had all these factories that made goods that no one needed anymore. So this led to decreases in urban wages, to unemployment, and to urban unrest, things like riots. The population of Japan continued to grow, but Japan doesn't have a lot of natural resources. And even at this time, Japan was not self-sufficient in food. The Japanese were not able to feed themselves. They had to import food. Now, as long as they keep selling things on the international market so they can buy food and other resources they need, it's fine. Again, one thing, it's not just food that they lack. Japan didn't have rubber. It didn't have oil. It lacked a lot of the things you need for a modern economy. So it was dependent on international trade to feed its people and to get the resources it needed to maintain its empire. So those are domestic problems. There were also foreign problems. The Soviet Union has come into power. Japan does not want communism. Peace preservation law was voted to keep out communism. Japan wants to keep its emperor system, which is also connected to private property. So that leads to fears about communism and also fears about a united China. Japan did not want a strong united China because a strong united China would control its resources. Right? Japan wants to be able to dominate China so that it can get the resources it needs from China. A China that is united and strong is able to control itself, and Japan can't get those resources as easily. But if China is divided and weak, that helps Japan, which is one reason why Japan is going to invade China. Because Japan invades China because China is becoming too strong, in part. And they're afraid they won't be able to get those natural resources. So that was Japan in the 20s. But then Japan gets hit by the Depression. And things get even worse. Remember, Japan, like I said, is dependent on the international market. It needs to be able to go to the international market to buy the food it needs. In 1929, though, you had the stock market crash. In 1929 to 1931, the price of basic agricultural crops will drop by 43%. So that hurts the peasants in Japan. They lose half their income. So a lot of those people are going to lose their land, right? In the during the Depression, 50%, there's going to be a 50% eviction rate of peasants. Unemployment will be 15 to 20%. Now the Japanese hope, they said, okay, this is bad. Well, let's try and export more. If we export more goods, we can buy the food we need, we get the oil we need and all those other things. But the problem was, other countries didn't want Japan to do that. It's just like we have today. If one country sells us a lot of things, that means we're not making it for ourselves. That means less jobs. Japan wanted to and other countries also had high unemployment. So people engaged in what's called protectionism. They would tax Japanese goods that were being imported into the country. Made Japanese goods more expensive, people didn't want to buy them. It protected jobs at home. So for example, the Japanese wanted to sell the Americans we'll say silk, and we want to protect American silk, or we'll say rice, Americans grow rice. The Japanese want to sell us rice. We want to make sure that our rice growers are able to, that's a bad example, I'm sorry, we'll go back to silk. I apologize. You don't manufacture rice, you manufacture silk. We have silk factories, Japan has silk factories, they sell us silk cheaper than what we can make it. That means Americans will lose their jobs because our factories won't be able to compete with Japan, they'll go out of business. So we just put a tax on Japanese silk to raise the price so it's higher than American silk. Then our people can keep their jobs. So because of this protectionism, Japan is going to find it more and more difficult to sell things overseas. Right? They're going to find it more and more difficult to sell things overseas. They're not going to be able to buy as much of the food, the oil, the rubber, the other things they need. So this is very bad. Right? Japan, which is dependent on international trade, is finding it more and more difficult to get what it needs on the international market. So, and democracy, the democratic government, is unable to deal with these problems. So internationalism, working together with other countries, and democracy are not helping Japan solve its problems in the 1920s and early 1930s. They're not. And you may remember I gave you this example. You had this Washington Naval Conference, or actually, we'll skip this. But this was just one example you may remember, was Japan wanted to build more ships. They had an agreement. All the countries got together and said, we're only going to build a certain number of ships so we don't get in a competition, an arms race with ships. But the Japanese were only allowed to build 3 ships for every 5 American ships, every 5 British ships. The Japanese tried to raise that number from 553 to 1017, so it's only a very little bit increase. And the Western powers wouldn't even let them do that. And to show you the anger and frustration about this is the prime minister who tried to negotiate this deal but failed. He was shot by a Japanese assassin, and he died several months later. So there's this kind of frustration with the West here, and frustration with democracy among Japanese people. Playing by the West rules, playing by democracy's rules isn't working. So Japan is going to try and solve its problems by expanding into China. Okay, we can't get our natural resources from international trade. We can't get the oil we need, we can't get the rice we need, we can't get the rubber we need. We can't get that through international trade. We need to expand our empire so that we'll control those products directly. Right? We're not like the United States. We don't have oil, so we need to take over a country that has oil. We're not like the United States. We don't have all this land to grow food. We need to take over a place like China, which has lots of land to grow food. So the Japanese military, not the Japanese home government in Tokyo, but the Japanese military in 1931 will invade and take Manchuria, Chinese territory. And they'll make it an independent country in 1932. It's not. It's a puppet government. And when Japan is criticized for that, Japan will withdraw from the League of Nations. Right? It says, well, you Westerners, your international bodies, you Westerners aren't helping us anyways. Why should we stay in the League of Nations? Right? We Japanese have a serious economic problem. We need to be able to feed our people. We need to be able to get the natural resources to maintain our empire, to defend ourselves. And you're not helping us. So we're just going to go out and take what we want. We're going to go out and take Manchuria if we need it. And then later on, of course, they're going to expand into China to get those natural resources. Now, in part, this happens. Why is it I'll go through this. I don't expect you to know all this information. But basically what happens is a lot of assassins, many of them who are members of the military, start killing Japanese officials. And I gave one example. In just 15 years, 3 serving and 2 former prime ministers were assassinated, and there were attempts on 2 others. And these are either soldiers who are doing this, or civilians who are pro-military and pro-emperor. They're doing this always in the name of the emperor. And eventually what happens is the government, the democracy still continues to function all throughout the Japanese, or the military period, but they just accept whatever the military wants because they don't want to be assassinated. Right? They accept what the military wants because they don't want to be assassinated. And what ends up happening is the military, once it takes over the government and invades China, or I'm sorry, it takes over the government, takes Manchuria, starts to build up its military, this actually helps Japan to recover economically. Japan's going to go from a labor surplus to having a high unemployment rate to a labor shortage. They're actually going to have to start importing Koreans from the colony of Japan's colony in order to work. And this works for a time. However, the logic of it was to build up this big army to invade China, to get the natural resources they need. Remember also they want to invade China because Chiang is being too successful in China. Chiang is uniting China. We don't want to unite China because then we won't be able to get the resources we need. So then they invade China. And this time you may remember that Chiang has been forced to accept an alliance with the communists. So this time China fights back. Right? Before, Chiang Kai-shek had given way to the Japanese because he didn't think he could beat them. Now he's forced to fight them. And now China, much to the surprise of the Japanese, is going to fight back. And the Japanese are going to understand this as a holy war.
A holy war.
Yeah, they're fighting for their divine country, to maintain their divine country, which is ruled over by a divine emperor, the only such country to be so blessed, to have someone like that on the throne. Right? One Japanese school child, I like this, explained it this way, in England, English people say, God save the king, and they believe that their king is bad, they can overthrow him. But we believe that our king is a god. Right? It's much better from the Japanese point of view. So they see this as a holy war. Now, one question was, why were they so brutal? And part of it was, of course, because it was seen as a holy war. Right? You're fighting the infidel then. You're fighting people who are opposed to the will of the gods. Therefore, they're terrible people. You can kill them. But there were also some other reasons. One thing you may remember, the Japanese army was very brutal to its own soldiers. The Japanese army was very brutal to its own soldiers. I think I told you it was common for officers to beat their men, to physically beat their men. And then if the officers got tired of beating their men, they would have the men line up, facing each other, and then the men would be ordered to hit each other. Right, so the officers would get too tired from beating their men, they'd have the men beat themselves. That's brutal. In addition, you'll remember, Japanese soldiers were expected to fight to the death. They were not supposed to surrender. They were told constantly, it is a shame to surrender, you should never surrender, don't do it. And oh, by the way, if you do surrender, your family won't get a pension. If you die in battle, your family gets a pension. You surrender, they get nothing. So, good reason to keep fighting. But of course, this also led Japanese soldiers to look down on prisoners of war. If you were a Chinese or American prisoner of war, the Japanese looked at you like you were a terrible person because you had accepted the shame of surrendering. And so they didn't think anything about killing you. You were a shameful person, you were a terrible person because you surrendered rather than dying. So therefore, you didn't deserve to be treated well. So they killed a lot of people just outright, and sometimes the soldiers just died from neglect. Of course, also remember, just as Japan said, okay, the international conferences, the League of Nations, these international organizations aren't working for us. Why should we follow Western understandings of civilization about civilized rules of warfare? You may remember Fukuzawa Yukichi, right? He said, we need to follow the West. We need to accept this civilization. That worked for Japan until the 1930s. Then Japanese people started saying, well, this isn't working. Let's try something else. Of course, Japan also, because they saw themselves as members of a divine, holy country fighting a holy war, there was a lot of racism towards Chinese people and towards Americans, so it's okay to do terrible things to them. But one thing I really want to emphasize, this was also a strategy. This was also a strategy. This wasn't just individual Japanese soldiers acting poorly. This was a government strategy, a military strategy that was ordered by officers. The Chinese are fighting back, and the Japanese were very frustrated by that. They're really racist. They're like, who are these Chinese, these inferior race? Who are they to fight back against us? They said, we need to break them. We need to break their will to fight. so we'll do terrible things to them. Right? We're not just going to kill soldiers, we're going to kill civilians, we're going to commit acts of mass rape, we're going to torture people, we're going to machine gun prisoners, we're going to use biological weapons, we're going to bomb cities with large civilian populations, and so forth. And this was done not just because the Japanese were angry, this was a strategy, an effort to brutalize the Chinese so they would give up. This strategy usually doesn't work in wartime, but doesn't stop people from trying it. People continuously try it, though it doesn't usually work. Okay, there was a few more questions that people asked that I could, or any questions about that? Okay, there was a few more questions people asked that I can deal with a little briefly. I don't need to go back to the PowerPoint, so I want to talk about them. Someone asked a question about the leftist critique of cultural nationalism. I'm missing a parentheses there. This is going back to colonial Korea. Right? This is going back to colonial Korea. So this is Korea in the 1920s particularly. You remember there was these people called cultural nationalists in Korea. These were Koreans who said, if we build up our country, if we build up our nation, if we become more educated, develop our industrial capacity, then eventually we'll become a strong people and Japan will leave. If we develop our Korea, we were colonized by Japan because we Koreans were weak. If we make ourselves strong, once we become strong, the Japanese will leave. That was the cultural nationalist perspective. The leftists, the people on the political left, these were socialists and communists, said, you guys are nuts. You guys are unrealistic. The Japanese will never leave. Right? The Japanese will never leave on their own. We have to force the Japanese out. And that's one reason why the communists in Korea were the ones who actually fought the Japanese for the most part.
So one dealt with knowledge and building up military, where those were called colonial Koreans, and when the communist socialists used violence to drive them out.
Well, no, the cultural nationalists said that they didn't say anything about building up the military. If we build up our people morally, if we build up our industry, if we build up our level of civilization,
right,
then the Japanese will just leave on their own. But the leftists, the socialists and communists said the Japanese will never leave on their own. We will have to drive them out through force. You're unrealistic. The Japanese would never leave on their own. And so there's a division among Koreans about how they should deal with these problems. Okay, there was a question, why does Japan expand the war in China? Remember, Japan is just fighting China, to include the United States, Great Britain, and the Netherlands. Again, it comes down to natural resources. In 1940, the United States said to Japan, stop invading China, or we won't sell you oil and scrap iron anymore. Okay, those are two things you need. Right? You cannot continue a war with oil and scrap iron, or without those things. You need those things if you're going to continue fighting. So that's the idea. That's what you need if you're going to continue fighting. So the Japanese were in a problem. The Americans said, we won't sell you these things unless you pull out of China. But they were in China to get natural resources that they thought they needed. So the Japanese said, well, we're just going to have to take a gamble. Let's just attack the Americans, attack the British, take their colonies, take the Philippines, take Singapore, take Malaysia, take Indonesia, take those colonies, get all the natural resources we need. Then we'll get the oil, then we'll get the rubber and everything we need. Once we do that, we'll just hold out. Right? We don't need to go to the United States and invade the United States. We just need to take over these islands and build like this kind of fortifications there, and the Americans will just give up. The Americans are weak and don't want to lose a lot of people, so it will just make it too difficult for them to fight against us. So if they will lose a lot of people, they'll just give up. So basically the idea was that they needed natural resources. And if they withdrew from China, they couldn't get those natural resources. So better to expand the war, take the natural resources they needed, and hope that they could hold out. Yes, Jared?
Well, so why were the islands that they were looking to take over?
They just wanted to destroy the Navy there. Yeah, they didn't want to actually keep Hawaii. They just wanted to blow up our Navy so we couldn't invade back. But good question. There was a question about one thing I want to make clear. When Korea was divided, remember Korea is divided to accept the surrender of Japanese forces, but eventually that surrender becomes permanent. In South Korea, this guy named Syngman Rhee is put into power by the United States. Right, so Syngman Rhee is in South Korea. South Korea is pro-US. In the north, you have this guy, Kim Il-sung. He's in North Korea. He's the communist, and he's put into power by the Soviet Union. So when you think Kim Il-sung, think communist, North Korea. When you hear Syngman Rhee, think pro-US, South Korea. Now someone asked, I just want to review this. There was a little bit of confusion, and I want to stress, North Korea actually did invade South Korea. North Korea is the one that actually started the war. It actually launched a full-scale invasion of South Korea. And because of that, the UN labeled North Korea as an aggressor. Right? Remember, the UN had sponsored the election in the South that elected Syngman Rhee. So an attack on that government was seen as illegitimate. Right? North Korea, which was not recognized by the UN, was not connected to that UN election, had attacked a country that had a government elected under an election sponsored by the United Nations. And then this last question, how did the Korean War end? This is kind of a trick question. The Korean War is still going on. There was never a peace treaty. The Korean War is still technically going on. It's just we're taking a long 60-year timeout. There's only an armistice. An armistice is a timeout in a war. It's a timeout that you take so you can figure out a peace treaty. But there's still no peace treaty. So we're still technically at war with North Korea and with all these other countries involved. There is a question, and I ask you to change this. I think I said causes of division. I mentioned this on lecture 23. The second item is causes of division. Please change that. That should be causes of the Korean War. Causes of the Korean War. I made an error. I apologize when I made the review sheet. Causes of the Korean War. There's a lot of causes, but I basically try and boiled it down to 4. And I divide them whether they were internal or external. Internally, there was this question, what will Korea be? Will Korea be communist or not? Will it be a Western-style democracy, or will it be a government more like the Soviet Union, or later on like communist China? So that's a big question. What is Korea going to be? The other question is, what should we do with those Koreans who worked with the Japanese? Large numbers of Korean people had worked with the Japanese and had profited by working with the Japanese, sometimes by hurting other Korean people. What should we do with those people? Should we punish them because of what they did? Or should we keep them around because they have skills we need? What should we do with them?
Why couldn't they just agree on to the ones who did do harm to the Koreans that were pro-Japanese, you should just excommunicate them from the country. And the ones who didn't, then you can use them for helpful resources. Why couldn't they just come to an agreement like that?
Well, no, there were lots of people who had worked with the Japanese.
Right.
So, and if you exiled them, you had to find some place for them to go.
Right.
And then you would be losing their skills.
Okay.
Most of the business community, for example, had cooperated because if you didn't collaborate, you couldn't do business. But if you get rid of all them, then you have no business people. And so it's a problem. There are external problems, though, as well. Remember, there's an ideological battle taking place throughout the world. Communism versus liberal democracy. So this is going to lead to people being willing to support these countries. It's going to help lead to the war. And of course, also the Soviet Union, China, and the United States are all going to have an interest in this strategic importance of Korea. Korea is a strategically important place. If the communists have control of Korea, they threaten Japan. Remember, we wanted Japan to be a pro-democracy, pro-capitalist foundation for anti-communism. On the other hand, from the communist perspective, a pro-democratic Korea threatens China and the Soviet Union. So there's also strategic interests here as well. So these are the kind of the main causes. We have a few minutes left. That's all I had in terms of questions you had for me. But before I dismiss, no one really, except for Lu Xun, no one asked me about the names. And remember, I gave the list of names I expect you to be able to recognize. So does anyone want to ask me about these names? Yes, Elizabeth. Yu Kwan Soon.
Yeah, but she the one that tried to assassinate
Okay, the one who tried to assassinate was this lady, Kano Sugako. She tried to kill the Japanese emperor. By the way, just as a kind of a tip when you're taking the test, anytime you see a name that has multiple syllables like this, if both names have multiple syllables, Kano Sugako, that's a Japanese name. Japanese names are usually longer than Chinese and Korean names. If it's a name that is only 2 syllables like this, Lu Xun, he's probably Chinese or Korean. Mostly Chinese. A name like Yu Kwan Soon, 1-syllable family name, 2-syllable personal name, usually Korean or Japanese, or I'm sorry, usually Korean or Chinese. So whenever you see a really long name, it's probably Japanese, if it's multiple syllables. Yes, Fantasia? The third one, Hatayo. Okay. All right, let me think. So we've got those 3. So let me start again with these 2. So you can kind of compare. Remember also, whenever you see Ko, that's what in Japanese, that's usually a woman's name. Ko means child. And that's used with girls' names. Almost never used with male names. And I put these 2 together, and so you can see Haruko, Sugako. Those are both Japanese women. You may remember Hatayama Haruko was kind of this woman who was an ideal of what it meant to be a civilized, enlightened Japanese woman. I think she is here. Right, here's the Hatayomo Haruko slide. Where she was the woman who became a teacher, and she learned to speak English really well, so she adopted Western language and Western ideas. But remember, she didn't use those things to serve herself. She didn't use those things to become like a feminist or to become a woman who understood herself as working to follow her own dreams and aspirations. She used them to serve men. Right? She used them to serve her husband. She always put her husband first. She used them to serve her son. And you see, remember, she wrote this article, Education Centered on Motherhood. Right? So we want young women to be educated with Western knowledge so they can be good mothers. So she's a woman who adopts Chinese and Western learning, modern civilization, but she does so in a way that advances the Meiji ideal of civilization and enlightenment. She's serving her country with that knowledge, and she's serving her men with that knowledge. That's what she's kind of focusing on there. In contrast, Kano Sugako was rather different. She was much more of a modern kind of feminist in some ways. She was not interested in serving men. Men had often not been very nice to her in her life. Remember, she was a rape victim. And she adopted not these kind of conservative ideas. She adopted feminism, anarchism, and socialism. Remember, socialism in particular was banned by the government in 1925. She's not going to live, though, to be 1925 until 1925. No, she only lives to be 1911. And that's because she and her buddies get together and try and assassinate the Japanese emperor. So she's threatening this kind of ideal. Right? She's taking Western knowledge, feminism, socialism, anarchism, is using it to claim liberation from men and using it to oppose the government, whereas Haruko is using it to serve men in the government. Yes, Michael?
Both of them are Japanese, right?
They're both Japanese. Both those people are Japanese. Yes, Dana?
Part one, you one.
Yes. So I'm going to do the 2 Koreans right now, very quickly.
One of them was a woman who went against the Japanese invasion. Yeah, her.
Right.
She died.
Yu Kwan Soon is using this kind of new Western knowledge. Remember, she's a Protestant Christian. She's educated, has a Western education. She's going to use that to oppose Japanese colonization of Korea. Remember, she takes part in this thing called the March 1st movement. Right here, right, where the Koreans run around saying we want independence from Japan and the Japanese machine gun them. And because she takes part in this movement, even though she's a young girl, remember, young girls didn't usually do this sort of thing in Korea at this time. Don't get involved politically, but she's going to do it. She's going to be killed. She's going to be beaten to death by the Japanese. But so she's, in a sense, she's similar to Haruko, though. She's using, even though she's a woman with modern knowledge, she's going to use that modern knowledge to serve her country. She's not going to be saying, I want better opportunities for women, I want gender equality. She says, I want a free Korea, I want an independent Korea. In comparison, you have this lady, Park Kyung-won. You can think of her, she is the Korean, kind of similar to the Korean Amelia Earhart. She was one of the first Korean women to become an aviator. And on one side, she was very proud of her Korean identity. She refused to change her name. She did not take a Japanese name. She would only use her Korean name, Park Kyung-won. At the same time, though, she only became an aviator through Japanese sponsorship. Japanese people helped her to become an aviator. And you can see that kind of here, right? She's waving a Japanese flag. And when she died in this plane crash, it was a crash that was, her plane was supposed to go from Tokyo to Seoul to Manchuria. So she was connecting Japan's empire. So in one sense, she's tricky. She's not anti-Japanese. She's not serving the Korean nation first. She's more interested in fulfilling her own dreams and aspirations. And men would say, you know, the Korean nationalist men would say, look, you've got to serve the nation first. And she would say, well, can't I serve my gender first? Why can't I live out my aspirations like I want to? Okay, Michael?
So Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong were opposite in China, correct?
Yeah,
And Kim Il-sung and Sigmund Freud were opposites in Korea.
exactly.
And Nagi, he was the one that wrote
The guy Takashi, you want to connect him to the atomic, right, Dana? You want to connect him to the atomic bomb. Remember, he was the guy that was a Catholic whose wife was killed in the atomic bomb. And he came with this idea that the people who died in the atomic bomb were the pure sacrifice necessary to end the war. Right? They were the pure sacrifice necessary to end the war. So any other questions? Yes, Fantasia? Kamikaze, those are the Japanese suicide pilots. That's the only thing up there that's not a name, I believe. Those are the guys, the Japanese, who would fly their ships, fly their airplanes loaded with explosives into American ships. They were very effective at killing large numbers of Americans, and of course a lot of Japanese also died. Jared?
Thanos guy who said she was a socialist. How would you?
Yeah.
How would you define the difference between socialist and communist?
Communists are more into radically reforming society. They go even further than the socialists. For this class, that's all you need, but I pretty much use them together. Okay. All right, well, good luck on Wednesday. I'll see you all then. I'm sorry? There will be, if I recall correctly, I need to look back over it. There will probably be an essay, but I will make it, I will give hints about it. It won't be just, you have to study everything.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Andy Sequoia? Yes, Anna. Okay.
Because I'm going with the program,
the aviator.
The what program?
the internship, the history,
Okay.
Dr. Floyd, Dr. Fishman.
Oh, the talk program. Okay, yeah, okay, I know about that, yeah.
So we'll be leaving Friday at 8.
Okay.
So I'll be here Friday.
All right, thank you for letting me know. Have a good time
All right.
being in Atlanta instead of studying communism.
You can renew.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm